Margaret Chun had been teaching piano in the small town of Willowbrook for 32 years. Her studio was located in a modest building on Main Street, right between the flower shop and the old bakery. Every afternoon, children of all ages would walk through her door, sit at her beautiful grand piano, and learn to play music. The piano itself was special. It was a Steinway that her grandmother had given her when she was just 7 years old. Margaret had played on that very piano since childhood, and now she shared it with her student Dot at 61 years old. Margaret was known throughout the town as the best piano teacher anyone could find. Her students had won countless competitions. Many of them had gone on to study at famous music schools in New York and Boston. Parents would put their children's names on a waiting list for years just to get a spot in her classes. She was strict but kind, demanding but patient. She believed that every child had music inside them, waiting to come out. But something had been happening to Margaret over the past few months, something she had not told anyone about. It started small, so small that she barely noticed it at first. Her fingers would feel stiff in the morning. She would drop things sometimes. A cup of coffee, a pencil, her keys. She thought it was just age. Everyone gets a little clumsy when they get older, she told herself. Nothing to worry about. Then the tingling started. It came mostly at night, when she was lying in bed. Her fingers would tingle and feel numb, like they had fallen asleep. She would shake her hands and rub them together, and the feeling would go away. But it kept coming back. Week after week, it got worse. The tingling started happening during the day, too. Sometimes it happened while she was teaching, right in the middle of showing a student how to play a difficult passage. One Tuesday afternoon in September, Margaret was teaching her most advanced student, a 16-year-old girl named Sophie. Sophie was brilliant. She was preparing for a competition that could earn her a scholarship to Juilliard, one of the most famous music schools in the world. Margaret was showing her how to play a complicated section from Chopin. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. That was when it happened. Her right hand suddenly went completely numb. Not just tingling, but completely without feeling. She could see her hand on the keys, but she could not feel them. She pressed down, but her fingers did not respond the way they should. The notes came out wrong, jumbled and ugly. Sophie looked at her with confusion. Margaret pulled her hands away from the piano quickly. She laughed and made an excuse about being tired. Sophie nodded and continued practicing on her own. But Margaret's heart was pounding. She looked down at her hand. It looked normal. It looked exactly the same as it always had. But something was very wrong. That night, Margaret sat alone in her apartment above the studio. She held her hands in front of her and studied them. These hands had played thousands of songs. They had taught hundreds of children. They had created beautiful music for over 50 years. They were everything to her. Without them, who was she? She decided to see a doctor. She made an appointment for the following week, not wanting to seem dramatic. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was worried for no reason. But deep inside, she knew. Something in her body knew that her life was about to change forever. The week passed slowly. Margaret continued to teach, but she was careful now. She let her students play more. She gave verbal instructions instead of demonstrations. Nobody seemed to notice anything was different. She was good at hiding things. She had been hiding things her whole life. The doctor's office was cold and quiet. Margaret sat on the examination table in a paper gown, feeling small and old. The doctor was a young woman named Dr. Patterson. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice. She asked Margaret questions about her symptoms. How long had this been happening? Where exactly did she feel the numbness? Did it happen at certain times more than others? Margaret answered every question honestly. She described the tingling, the stiffness, the morning when she could not button her own shirt. She told the doctor about the day with Sophie, when her hand went completely dead on the piano keys. Dr. Patterson listened carefully, writing notes on a clipboard. Then she did some tests. She asked Margaret to squeeze her fingers. She poked her hands with a small instrument to test her feeling. She asked her to touch her thumb to each finger. One at a time. When the tests were done, Dr. Patterson sat down across from Margaret. Her face was serious. She said that she wanted to run more tests, blood work and scans, to be sure of what was happening. But she had some ideas about what it might be. She mentioned several possibilities: carpal tunnel syndrome, nerve damage, or something else, something more serious that she did not want to name yet. Margaret went home that night feeling like she was walking through a dream. The streets of Willowbrook looked different somehow. The leaves were changing colors, red and orange and gold, but she could not enjoy them. All she could think about was her hands. All she could think about was the piano. She sat down at her Steinway and placed her hands on the keys. She tried to play something simple, a piece she had played 1,000 times before. Her left hand was fine, but her right hand stumbled. The fingers would not go where she wanted them to go. She stopped playing and sat in silence, staring at the piano that had been her whole life. Margaret Shawn was not a woman who cried easily. She had been through hard times before. She had lost her husband 10 years ago. She had survived cancer in her 40s. She had faced difficulties that would have broken other people. But sitting there at her piano, with her failing hands resting on the keys, she felt tears running down her face. She did not know what was coming. She did not know how bad it would get. But she knew that everything she had built, everything she loved, was in danger of slipping away. The test results came back 2 weeks later. Dr. Patterson called Margaret into her office for a private conversation. The room felt smaller than before, the walls closing in as Margaret waited to hear her fate. The doctor did not waste time with small talk. She told Margaret that she had a condition called progressive sensory motor neuropathy. In simple terms, the nerves in her hands were slowly dying. The damage would spread over time. There was no cure. There were treatments that might slow it down, but eventually, Margaret would lose most of the feeling and movement in her hands. Margaret sat very still as the doctor explained what this would mean. She would have trouble with fine motor skills, buttoning shirts, holding a pen, playing the piano. The doctor said these words gently, carefully, knowing what they would mean to someone like Margaret. But no amount of gentleness could soften the blow. Margaret felt like someone had reached into her chest and pulled out her heart. She asked questions. How long did she have? The doctor could not say for certain. Every case was different. Some people progressed slowly over many years. Others lost function more quickly. It depended on many factors. Margaret might have 5 years of playing left. She might have 5 months. Nobody could know for sure. When Margaret left the doctor's office, she walked for hours through the streets of Willowbrook. She did not know where she was going. She just walked. She passed the school where she had given her first piano recital at age 8. She passed the church where she had played for her husband's funeral. She passed the community center where her students performed every spring. Music was everywhere in this town, and most of it connected back to her. She decided that she would not tell anyone. Not yet. She needed time to figure out what to do. She had students depending on her. She had Sophie, who was so close to achieving her dream. She had parents who trusted her with their children. How could she tell them that her hands were failing? How could she admit that she was no longer the teacher they thought she was? The following Monday, Margaret returned to her studio as if nothing had happened. She greeted her students with the same warm smile. She listened to their practice pieces with the same careful ear. But she did not play as much as before. She made excuses. Her hands were tired. She had a slight injury. She wanted them to develop independence. Her students did not question her. They trusted her completely. But hiding her condition was harder than she expected. There were moments when her hands would shake, and she had to put them in her pockets. There were times when she could not demonstrate a technique because her fingers would not cooperate. She started wearing gloves more often, even indoors, claiming that her hands were cold. Nobody thought much of it. She was getting older, after all. Old people got cold easily. The first person to notice something was wrong was not a student or a parent. It was Helen, who owned the flower shop next door. Helen was in her 70s, a widow like Margaret, and the two women had been friends for 20 years. Every morning, Helen would bring Margaret a cup of tea before her first lesson. They would sit together for a few minutes and talk about the day ahead. One morning in October, Helen came in with the tea as usual. Margaret reached for the cup, and her hand trembled badly. The tea splashed onto the table. Margaret tried to laugh it off, but Helen saw the fear in her eyes. Helen did not push. She just cleaned up the spill and handed Margaret the cup again, steadying her hand as she did. Later that day, Helen came back to the studio after closing her shop. She found Margaret sitting at the piano, not playing, just sitting. Helen sat down beside her on the bench and asked what was wrong. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then, slowly, she told Helen everything. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the fear that she would lose everything she had worked for. Helen listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, Helen took her hand, the same hand that could no longer feel properly, and held it tight. She told Margaret that she was not alone. She told her that keeping this secret would only make things harder. But she also promised not to tell anyone until Margaret was ready. That promise meant everything to Margaret. For the first time since the diagnosis, she felt a tiny bit of hope. Not hope that she would get better, because the doctor had been clear about that, but hope that she might find a way through this darkness. Hope that she might still matter, even if she could no longer play. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened. Margaret continued teaching, continued hiding, continued pretending that everything was normal. But inside, she was struggling. Every dropped pencil felt like a defeat. Every stumbled note felt like a preview of the end. She started sleeping less, lying awake at night, thinking about all the things she might never do again. She thought about Sophie often. The competition was just 3 months away. Sophie was counting on Margaret to prepare her. But how could Margaret prepare anyone when she could barely play herself? She considered telling Sophie the truth. But every time she tried, the words stuck in her throat. Sophie had worked so hard. She deserved a teacher who was whole, not broken. One evening, Margaret made a decision. She would push through the next 3 months. She would get Sophie ready for the competition, no matter what it cost her. After that, she would figure out what to do next. Maybe she would retire. Maybe she would find another way to teach. But first, she had to fulfill this one last promise. She did not know then how much that decision would cost her. She did not know that in trying to hide her condition, she would face the greatest humiliation of her life. She did not know that the people she had served for 30 years would turn against her. All she knew was that she loved her students, and she would do anything to help them succeed. The treatments Dr. Patterson prescribed helped a little. The medication slowed the progression slightly and reduced the tingling. But nothing could stop what was happening. Every week, Margaret noticed small changes. Things she could do before became difficult. Things that were difficult became impossible. Her world was shrinking, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Helen continued to visit every morning with tea. Sometimes they talked about Margaret's condition. Sometimes they talked about other things, flowers and weather, and the changing seasons. Helen never made Margaret feel like a patient or a problem. She just made her feel like a friend. In those morning conversations, Margaret found small moments of peace amidst the growing storm. The storm was coming. Margaret could feel it building. She just did not know when it would break. The winter arrived early that year, bringing snow and ice to Willowbrook by the middle of November. Margaret found that the cold made her symptoms worse. Her fingers stiffened painfully in the morning, and sometimes it took an hour of exercises before she could use them at all. She bought hand warmers and kept them in her pockets constantly. She soaked her hands in warm water before every lesson. She did everything the doctors told her to do, and still her condition worsened. Sophie was making excellent progress on her competition piece. She practiced 4 hours every day, and Margaret could hear the improvement in every lesson. The girl had extraordinary talent, the kind that came along once in a generation. Margaret had taught many gifted students over the years, but none quite like Sophie. Watching her play was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion, beautiful and miraculous. But Margaret was running out of ways to hide her condition from Sophie. The girl was observant and smart. She had started asking questions about why Margaret never played anymore. Margaret gave her usual excuses, but she could see the doubt in Sophie's eyes. Sophie was beginning to suspect that something was wrong. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in early December. Sophie was working on a particularly difficult passage from her competition piece. She was struggling with a section that required both hands to move in complicated patterns across the keyboard. She asked Margaret to demonstrate, to show her how it should be done. Margaret had been dreading this moment for weeks. She could have made another excuse. She could have told Sophie to watch a video or listen to a recording. But something in Sophie's eyes made her hesitate. The girl looked frustrated and tired. She had been working so hard, and she needed her teacher's help. Margaret could not bring herself to turn away. She sat down at the piano beside Sophie and placed her hands on the keys. She took a deep breath and began to play. For the first few measures, everything was fine. Her hands remembered the music, even if they could not feel it properly. But then she reached the difficult passage. Her right hand cramped suddenly, the fingers curling inward in a painful spasm. She hit several wrong notes in a row. The sound was terrible, nothing like music at all. Sophie stared at her in shock. Margaret tried to continue playing, but her hand would not obey her. She stopped and pulled her hands into her lap, hiding them from view. The silence in the room was heavy and awful. Sophie asked what was wrong. Her voice was gentle, concerned, not accusatory. But Margaret could not answer. If she opened her mouth, she would cry, and she had promised herself that she would not cry in front of her students. She mumbled something about needing a break and hurried out of the room, got in the bathroom. Margaret held her cramped hand under hot water and wept silently. This was it. This was the beginning of the end. She could not hide anymore. Sophie would tell other people. Word would spread. Everyone would know that the great Margaret Chun could no longer play piano. When she returned to the studio, Sophie was still sitting at the piano, waiting. The girl stood up when Margaret came in and did something unexpected. She walked over and hugged Margaret tightly. She said that she had known for a while that something was wrong. She had seen the way Margaret hid her hands, the way she avoided playing, the way she seemed sad all the time. She said that whatever was happening, she was not going to leave. Margaret broke down completely then. She told Sophie everything, the whole terrible truth. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the fear of losing everything she loved. Sophie listened quietly, still holding Margaret's hand. When Margaret finished, Sophie made her a promise. She said that no matter what happened, she would keep working hard. She would win that competition, not just for herself, but for Margaret too. That conversation changed something between them. They were no longer just teacher and student. They were partners, fighting together against something bigger than both of them. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. At least one person knew the truth now. At least one person understood, but not everyone would be as understanding as Sophie. The parents of Margaret's other students had been whispering among themselves. They had noticed the changes too. The missed demonstrations, the shaking hands, the strange excuses. Some of them had started to wonder if Margaret was still capable of teaching their children. The first complaint came from Mrs. Patterson, whose 8-year-old son had been taking lessons for 2 years. She called Margaret one evening to say that she was concerned. She said that her son had reported that Mrs. Chun seemed sick, that her hands shook when she tried to play. Mrs. Patterson said she was not accusing Margaret of anything, but she needed to know what was going on. Her son's musical education was important to her. Margaret did not know what to say. She was not ready to tell everyone about her condition. She made up a story about a minor injury that was healing slowly. Mrs. Patterson seemed satisfied, but Margaret could hear the doubt in her voice. The seed of suspicion had been planted. More complaints followed over the next 2 weeks. Parents called or sent emails asking questions. Some of them pulled their children from Margaret's classes without explanation. Others demanded to know if Margaret was planning to retire soon. The whispers grew louder. Margaret Chun was losing her touch. Margaret Chun was getting too old. Margaret Chun could not play piano anymore. Each complaint felt like a knife in Margaret's heart. These were people she had served for decades. She had taught their children and their grandchildren. She had attended their birthday parties and graduations. She had been part of their families in a way that few outsiders ever were. And now they were turning on her because she was sick. Helen tried to comfort her. She said that people were just worried about their children, that they did not mean to be cruel. But Margaret knew better. She had seen how the world treated people who were no longer useful. She had seen it happen to others, and now it was happening to her. She was becoming invisible, disposable, someone to be replaced. The town council received a formal complaint in the week before Christmas. A group of parents had written a letter asking for an investigation into Margaret's teaching abilities. They said that she was no longer providing adequate instruction. They said that their children deserved better. They requested that the council review her qualifications and consider whether she should be allowed to continue teaching. Margaret read a copy of that letter on Christmas Eve. She sat alone in her apartment, the letter in her trembling hands, and she felt something break inside her. 32 years of service. Hundreds of students taught. Countless awards and honors. And it all came down to this, a formal complaint because she was sick. She did not know yet that things were about to get much worse. She did not know about the town meeting that was being planned. She did not know that she would be forced to face her accusers and defend herself in front of everyone she had ever known. All she knew was that her hands were failing, and the world was punishing her for it. The town meeting was scheduled for the second week of January. Margaret received notice of it in a formal letter from the council, delivered to her studio by a nervous young clerk who could not meet her eyes. The letter said that concerns had been raised about her professional conduct and abilities. It said that she would have an opportunity to address these concerns at a public meeting. It said that failure to attend might result in the revocation of her teaching license. Margaret read the letter several times, trying to understand how things had gotten this far. She had devoted her entire life to this town. She had turned down offers from prestigious music schools in other cities because she loved Willowbrook. She had stayed through hard times, through economic downturns and personal tragedies, because this was her home. And now her home was putting her on trial. She called Dr. Patterson and asked for a letter explaining her medical condition. The doctor was happy to provide one. She wrote a detailed explanation of Margaret's diagnosis, the treatments she was receiving, and her prognosis. She emphasized that Margaret's cognitive abilities were completely intact and that her condition only affected her hands. She stated clearly that Margaret was still capable of teaching music, even if she could not demonstrate advanced techniques herself. Margaret hoped the letter would be enough. She hoped that once people understood she was sick, they would show compassion. She did not know how wrong she would be. The week before the meeting, Margaret continued to teach as normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Some parents refused to bring their children. Others sat in on lessons, watching Margaret with suspicious eyes. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, in the grocery store, at the library, even at church. She could hear people talking about her, their voices dropping to a hush when she approached. Sophie remained loyal. She came to every lesson and practiced harder than ever. The competition was just 6 weeks away now. Sophie had improved dramatically, her playing reaching new levels of beauty and technical skill. Margaret felt proud of her, even as everything else in her life fell apart. The night before the town meeting, Margaret could not sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she would say. She had prepared a speech, written and rewritten it a dozen times. She wanted to explain her condition without asking for pity. She wanted to remind people of everything she had given to this community. She wanted to ask for a chance to continue doing what she loved, but mostly, she wanted them to see her as a person, not just a pair of failing hands. The meeting was held in the town hall, an old brick building in the center of Willowbrook. Margaret arrived early, dressed in her best clothes, her grandmother's pearl necklace around her neck. She had worn that necklace to every important event in her life. It made her feel connected to the women who had come before her, women who had faced their own struggles with dignity and grace. The hall was already filling up when she arrived. She saw familiar faces everywhere, former students, their parents, neighbors she had known for decades. Some of them smiled at her sympathetically. Others looked away, embarrassed or hostile. A few nodded in encouragement, but most just stared, curious to see what would happen. The council members sat at a long table at the front of the room. There were 5 of them, 3 men and 2 women, all of them older and well-respected in the community. Margaret knew them all. She had taught piano to 2 of their children. She had played at their weddings and anniversaries. She had thought they were her friends. The meeting began with formal introductions and a reading of the complaint. The council chairman, a man named Robert Walsh, spoke in a dry, official voice. He said that several parents had raised concerns about Mrs. Chun's ability to provide adequate piano instruction. He said that these concerns centered on her apparent physical limitations and her refusal to explain them. He said that the council was here to listen to all sides and make a fair decision. Then the parents were invited to speak. One by one, they stood up and shared their complaints. Mrs. Patterson went first, describing how her son had come home upset because his teacher could not play anymore. Mr. Stevens spoke about the lesson his daughter had paid for where Margaret barely touched the piano. Mrs. Gordon complained that she had not received a refund when she pulled her daughter from classes. Margaret listened to every word, her face calm but her heart breaking. These were people she had cared about. She had been there for their children's first recitals, their breakthroughs, their moments of triumph. She had celebrated with them and comforted them through disappointments. And now they stood in front of the whole town and called her incompetent. The most painful testimony came from a man named David Chun. He was no relation to Margaret, despite sharing her last name. His teenage son had been one of her students for 8 years. David stood up and said that he had trusted Margaret with his son's musical education, and she had betrayed that trust by hiding her illness. He said that she had been dishonest and selfish. He said that a real professional would have admitted her limitations and stepped aside. When David finished, he looked directly at Margaret. There was anger in his eyes, but also something else. Hurt, maybe. Disappointment. Margaret wanted to explain that she had been scared, that she had not known what to do, that she was just trying to hold on to the one thing that gave her life meaning. But it was not yet her turn to speak. After the complaints were finished, the chairman invited Margaret to respond. She stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She walked to the front of the room and faced the crowd. She could see Sophie sitting in the back with her parents. Sophie gave her an encouraging smile. Margaret began to speak. She told them about her diagnosis. She read parts of the doctor's letter. She explained that her condition was progressive and incurable, that her hands would continue to deteriorate over time. She said that she had hidden it because she was afraid of exactly this moment, standing in front of everyone she loved while they judged her. She told them about her 32 years of teaching. She named students who had gone on to great success. She reminded them of the scholarships won, the lives changed, the music that had filled this town because of her work. She said that she might not be able to demonstrate every technique anymore, but she could still hear, still guide, still teach. A great teacher, she said, does not need perfect hands. A great teacher needs a good heart and a willing ear. When she finished, the room was silent. Some people were crying. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing perhaps that they had been too harsh. Margaret returned to her seat and waited for the verdict. But before the council could deliberate, something unexpected happened. Someone in the back of the room stood up and asked to speak. It was Sophie. She walked to the front of the hall, her head held high, and faced the crowd. She said that she had something important to tell them, something they needed to know before they made their decision. The room fell completely silent. Everyone waited to hear what Sophie would say. Sophie stood at the front of the town hall, her young face serious and determined. She was only 16 years old, but in that moment, she looked much older. She looked like someone who had important things to say and would not be silenced. She began by introducing herself, though most people in the room already knew who she was. She said that she had been studying with Mrs. Chun for 7 years, since she was 9 years old. She said that when she first came to Margaret's studio, she could barely play a simple scale. She had no confidence, no technique, no understanding of what music could be. Margaret had changed all of that. Sophie told the crowd about the hours Margaret had spent with her, patiently correcting her mistakes, encouraging her when she wanted to give up, pushing her to reach higher than she ever thought possible. She said that Margaret had never made her feel stupid or inadequate, even when she struggled with difficult pieces. Margaret had made her feel like she could do anything if she worked hard enough. And Sophie told them about the secret. She said that she was one of the few people who knew about Margaret's condition before tonight. She said that when Margaret had told her the truth, she had been afraid at first. She had wondered if Margaret could still teach her, still prepare her for the competition that meant everything to her. But then Sophie said something that made the room go completely quiet. She said that in the months since Margaret's diagnosis, her playing had improved more than ever before. Not in spite of Margaret's condition, but because of it. She said that Margaret had found new ways to teach, better ways. She used recordings and videos. She described techniques with words instead of demonstrations. She listened more carefully than ever, catching tiny mistakes that she might have missed before when she was focused on playing herself. Sophie said that Margaret had become a better teacher since losing the use of her hands. Not worse, better. The crowd stirred at this. People looked at each other with confused expressions. This was not what they had expected to hear. They had come to condemn Margaret, to take away her license, to punish her for getting sick. They had not expected a 16-year-old girl to stand up and defend her. Sophie was not finished. She told the crowd that she wanted to play something for them. She asked if there was a piano in the building. The chairman said there was an old upright in the storage room. Someone was sent to bring it out. While they waited, the room buzzed with whispered conversations. The piano was wheeled into the hall a few minutes later. It was dusty and out of tune, nothing like the beautiful Steinway in Margaret's studio. But Sophie did not seem to care. She sat down on the bench and stretched her fingers. Then she turned to look at Margaret. Their eyes met across the room. Margaret could see the love and gratitude in Sophie's eyes. She could also see determination, a fierce resolve to prove something important. Margaret nodded slightly, giving her permission, giving her blessing. Sophie turned back to the piano and began to play. The piece was from her competition program, the same Chopin that she had been practicing for months. It was incredibly difficult, full of complex passages that required years of training to master. Most professional pianists struggled with it, but Sophie played it beautifully. Her fingers flew across the keys with precision and grace. The melody rose and fell like waves on an ocean. The harmonies were rich and full, filling the old town hall with music that seemed to come from another world. People stopped whispering. People stopped moving. Everyone just listened. Margaret closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. This was what she had worked for. This was what she had sacrificed for. Not her own playing, but this, the ability to create musicians, to pass on the gift of music to the next generation. Her hands might be failing, but her teaching lived on in Sophie's fingers. When Sophie finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then the applause began. It started slowly, just a few people clapping, and more until the whole room was filled with the sound. People stood up from their seats. Some of them were crying. Even the council members were clapping. Sophie stood and bowed, then walked over to Margaret. She took Margaret's hand, the trembling, damaged hand that could no longer play, and held it up for everyone to see. These hands, Sophie said loudly, taught me everything I know. These hands created the music you just heard. Not by playing it themselves, but by guiding mine. This woman is the greatest teacher I have ever known. Her hands may be failing, but her gift is not. The room exploded with applause again. Margaret could not hold back her tears anymore. They streamed down her face as she looked at Sophie, this brave young girl who had just saved her life. The chairman called for order. When the room finally quieted down, he announced that the council would need to deliberate. He asked everyone to wait while they discussed the matter privately. The 5 council members stood and walked to a small room at the back of the hall. Margaret sat in her chair, exhausted and overwhelmed. Helen came to sit beside her and held her hand. Sophie sat on her other side. They waited together, not speaking, just being there for each other. The deliberation took nearly an hour. People grew restless. Some left to get coffee or use the bathroom. But Margaret did not move. She sat perfectly still, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Finally, the council members returned. They took their seats at the front table. The chairman stood and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. Every eye was on him. Margaret could hear her own heart beating in her chest. The chairman began to speak. He said that the council had carefully considered all the testimony presented. He said that they recognized the concerns of the parents who had filed complaints. He said that they also recognized Mrs. Chun's decades of service to the community. Then he paused. The silence stretched out, unbearable. He announced that the council had voted unanimously. Margaret Chun's teaching license would not be revoked. She would be allowed to continue teaching for as long as she was able and willing. However, the council requested that she provide regular updates on her condition and that she consider taking on an assistant to help with demonstrations. Margaret felt the tension drain from her body. She had won. Against all odds, against all the people who wanted to push her aside, she had won. But she knew that the real victory was not hers. It belonged to Sophie, the brave girl who had stood up when everyone else sat down. The crowd reacted with mixed emotions. Some people clapped. Others looked disappointed. A few of the parents who had complained got up and left without speaking to anyone. But most people stayed. Many of them came up to Margaret afterward to apologize, to say they had not understood, to wish her well. Margaret accepted every apology with grace. She did not hold grudges. She understood that people feared what they did not understand. She only hoped that tonight had taught them something important about compassion and about judging others. When the hall finally emptied, only Margaret, Sophie, and Helen remained. They stood together in the quiet room, surrounded by empty chairs and the fading echo of applause. Helen said it was time to go home. Margaret agreed. But before they left, she walked over to the old piano that Sophie had played. She placed her hand on its worn surface, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingers. This piano had been here for decades. It had survived neglect and time. It was damaged, but still beautiful, still capable of making music, just like her. The weeks after the town meeting were different. Something had shifted in Willowbrook. People who had avoided Margaret now stopped to talk to her on the street. Former students who had been silent reached out with messages of support. Parents who had pulled their children from her classes called to ask if they could return. Margaret accepted everyone back without complaint. She believed in second chances. Sophie's competition was now just 3 weeks away. The two of them worked harder than ever, refining every detail of her performance. Margaret could no longer demonstrate the difficult passages, but she had found other ways. She would sing the melody while Sophie played. She would tap the rhythm on the edge of the piano. She would describe the emotion she wanted Sophie to express, using words to paint pictures that Sophie could translate into music. Their partnership had become something beautiful. Margaret would close her eyes and listen, really listen to every note Sophie played. She could hear things she had never heard before, subtle details that she might have missed when she was focused on her own hands. Her ears had become sharper as her hands had grown weaker. It was as if her body was compensating, shifting its gifts from one sense to another. Sophie noticed the change too. She told Margaret that she felt like she was finally understanding what music was really about. It was not about perfect technique or impressive speed. It was about emotion, about telling a story, about connecting with the people who listened. Margaret had always told her this, but now she finally understood it in her bones. The night before Sophie left for the competition, Margaret invited her over for dinner. Just the two of them, in Margaret's small apartment above the studio. Margaret cooked the meal herself, a simple pasta with garlic bread and salad. Her hands shook as she stirred the sauce, but she managed. She had learned to manage. They ate together at the little kitchen table, talking about everything except the competition. They talked about Sophie's plans for college, about the boy she had a crush on, about a funny video she had seen online. They laughed and told stories. It felt like a celebration, even though the competition had not happened yet. After dinner, they went downstairs to the studio. Sophie sat at the Steinway for the last time before the competition. Margaret sat beside her on the bench, just like she had done thousands of times before. But this time was different. This time, Margaret reached out and placed her hands on the keys next to Sophie's. She could not play anymore. Not really. Her fingers would not cooperate. But she pressed down on a single key, a low bass note, and held it. The note rang out in the quiet room, deep and resonant. Sophie understood. She began to play the competition piece, weaving her melody around Margaret's single sustained note. They played together for almost an hour. Margaret held one note after another, simple bass tones that grounded Sophie's soaring melodies. It was not a real duet. Margaret was not really playing. But it felt like they were making music together, like they were connected through the piano in a way that went beyond teacher and student. When they finally stopped, both of them had tears in their eyes. Sophie hugged Margaret tightly and whispered thank you. Margaret whispered back that she was proud, so incredibly proud, of the musician Sophie had become. The next morning, Sophie and her parents drove to the city for the competition. Margaret stayed behind in Willowbrook. She could not bear to watch in person. The pressure would be too much. Instead, she stayed in her studio, waiting for news. The competition lasted 2 days. Sophie called Margaret after each round with updates. She had made it through the preliminary round. She had made it through the semifinals. Now she was one of 5 finalists, competing for the grand prize and the scholarship to Juilliard. Margaret could not eat or sleep while Sophie was competing. She paced around her apartment, looking at the clock every few minutes. Helen came by to keep her company, bringing tea and sandwiches that Margaret barely touched. The waiting was unbearable. The final round was scheduled for Saturday evening. Sophie would play her Chopin piece one last time in front of a panel of judges from the most prestigious music schools in the country. The winner would be announced immediately after all 5 finalists had performed. Margaret sat by her phone, her failing hands folded in her lap. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of lessons, the diagnosis, the town meeting, the parents who had wanted to take away her license, the young girl who had stood up and defended her. She thought about her own career, the one she had sacrificed for her students. She had been good enough to study at Juilliard herself, back when she was young. She had been offered scholarships and opportunities. But she had chosen to stay in Willowbrook, to teach rather than perform, to give rather than receive. Some people had called her foolish. Some had said she was wasting her talent. But sitting here now, waiting to hear if her student had won the biggest competition in the country, Margaret knew she had made the right choice. Her gift had not been wasted. It had been multiplied. Every student she had taught carried a piece of her with them. Her music lived on in their hands. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Margaret grabbed it with trembling fingers. It was Sophie. She was crying so hard that Margaret could barely understand her at first. But then the words came through, clear and unmistakable. She had won. Sophie had won first place. The scholarship was hers. Margaret dropped the phone. She could hear Sophie still talking, still crying, but she could not respond. Her whole body was shaking. Helen rushed over and picked up the phone, talked to Sophie for a few minutes, then hung up and turned to Margaret with tears streaming down her face. They hugged each other, laughing and crying at the same time. Margaret felt something lifting from her heart, a weight she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it was there. She had done it. Despite everything, despite her failing hands and the people who doubted her, she had done it. She had created a star. The town of Willowbrook exploded with celebration when the news spread. The local newspaper put Sophie's picture on the front page. The mayor called to congratulate Margaret personally. People who had signed a complaint against her sent flowers and apology notes. Everyone wanted to celebrate the town's triumph, but Margaret knew the truth. This was not the town's triumph. This was Sophie's triumph. This was what happened when a talented young person worked hard and refused to give up. Margaret had helped, but Sophie had done the real work. Sophie had put in the hours and faced the pressure and performed when it mattered most. When Sophie returned to Willowbrook 3 days later, she came straight to Margaret's studio. They sat together at the Steinway, looking at the trophy and the acceptance letter from Juilliard. Sophie said she could not have done it without Margaret. Margaret said she could not have kept going without Sophie. They were both right. That evening, they gave an impromptu concert in the studio. Word spread quickly, and soon the room was packed with people who wanted to hear Sophie play. She performed several pieces, including the Chopin that had won her the competition. Margaret sat in the corner and listened, her heart full of joy and sadness mixed together. Joy, because Sophie had achieved her dream. Sadness, because Margaret knew that her own time was running out. The doctors had told her that her condition was progressing. In a year or two, she might not be able to teach at all. This moment right now was the peak of her career. Everything after this would be a slow descent, but she did not let the sadness show. Tonight was for celebrating. Tonight was for Sophie. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, Margaret chose to be happy. She had earned it. 5 years passed after Sophie's victory. In that time, everything changed, and nothing changed at all. That Sophie graduated from Juilliard at the top of her class. She won more competitions and received invitations to perform at concert halls around the world. Critics called her one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. She was featured in magazines and interviewed on television. But no matter how famous she became, she never forgot to mention Margaret Chun, the small-town piano teacher who had believed in her when her hands could no longer play. Margaret's condition continued to progress, just as the doctors had predicted. By the 3rd year, she could no longer use her right hand at all. The left hand followed soon after. She learned to do things differently, to adapt and adjust. She hired an assistant, a young woman named Elena, who had studied music education in college. Elena handled the demonstrations, while Margaret provided guidance and feedback. The arrangement worked well. Students continued to come to Margaret's studio. Parents who had once complained now sent their children proudly, bragging to friends that their kids studied with the legendary Margaret Chun. The town meeting that had nearly ended her career became a distant memory, something people preferred not to talk about. Margaret forgave them all. She had more important things to do than hold grudges. Helen visited every day, bringing tea and conversation. The two friends grew even closer as the years passed. Helen helped Margaret with things that had become difficult, buttoning her coat, opening jars, writing notes to students. Margaret never asked for help, but Helen always seemed to know when it was needed. That was the nature of true friendship. Sophie came back to Willowbrook whenever she could between tours and performances. She would sit at the Steinway and play for Margaret, trying out new pieces, seeking advice about interpretation and emotion. Margaret could no longer play a single note, but her ears were sharper than ever. She could hear things in Sophie's playing that no one else could hear, tiny imperfections and hidden possibilities. On Margaret's 66th birthday, Sophie organized a surprise celebration. She flew in secretly and gathered all of Margaret's current and former students. They filled the studio and spilled out onto the sidewalk. When Margaret came downstairs that evening, thinking she was going to teach a lesson, she found 100 people waiting for her with cake and flowers and tears. One by one, students stepped forward to speak. A man in his 40s said that Margaret had saved his life, that music had given him purpose when he was lost and alone. A young mother said that her daughter had found her voice through Margaret's teaching. A teenager said that Margaret had believed in him when no one else did. The testimonials went on for 2 hours. Margaret listened to every word, her useless hands folded in her lap, tears streaming down her face. She had spent her whole life giving to others, never expecting anything in return. And now all that love was coming back to her, a river of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Sophie played last. She sat at the Steinway and performed a piece she had written herself, a tribute to Margaret. It was called Hands That Taught Me to Fly. The melody was simple but beautiful, moving through moments of sadness and joy, struggle and triumph. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the room. After the celebration, when everyone else had gone home, Margaret and Sophie sat together in the empty studio. The candles from the birthday cake flickered on the piano, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sophie asked Margaret if she had any regrets. Margaret thought about the question for a long time. She thought about the career she could have had, the concerts she could have played, the fame she could have enjoyed. She thought about her hands, once so nimble and strong, now curled and useless in her lap. She thought about all the losses and disappointments, all the moments when she had wanted to give up. But then she thought about Sophie. She thought about the 100 students who had come to celebrate her tonight. She thought about the music that would live on long after she was gone, in the hands of people she had taught, and the people they would teach, on and on forever. She told Sophie that she had no regrets. Not one. She said that she had been given a gift, the gift of teaching, and she had used it well. She said that her hands might have failed her, but her purpose had not. She had made a difference in the world. What more could anyone ask for? Sophie took Margaret's hand then, the hand that could no longer feel anything, and kissed it gently. She said that Margaret's hands had not failed. They had just found a different way to make music. Margaret smiled. She looked at the Steinway, the piano that had been with her since childhood, the piano that had witnessed every triumph and heartbreak of her career. She could not play it anymore, but it would not stay silent. Tomorrow, a new student would come. A new pair of hands would touch those keys. The music would continue. 3 months after her birthday celebration, Margaret Chun passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was surrounded by people who loved her. Sophie was holding her hand. The funeral was the largest Willowbrook had ever seen. People came from all over the country, former students who had heard the news and dropped everything to be there. The church was packed. The overflow crowd listened from speakers set up outside. Sophie played at the service. She performed the tribute she had written, "Hands That Taught Me to Fly," one last time. When she finished, she spoke about Margaret without any prepared notes. She said that Margaret had taught her that music was not about perfect technique or impressive performances. It was about connection, about speaking to people's hearts, about making the world a little more beautiful than you found it. She said that Margaret's hands might have stopped working, but her music would never stop. It lived in Sophie. It lived in every student Margaret had ever taught. It would live on forever, passed from generation to generation, a gift that could never be taken away. After the funeral, Sophie walked alone to Margaret's studio. The door was unlocked, just as Margaret always left it. She went inside and sat at the Steinway for the last time. She placed her hands on the keys and felt the cool ivory beneath her fingers. She played. She played for hours, everything she knew, everything Margaret had taught her. The music poured out of her, a river of sound that filled the empty room and drifted out the open windows into the streets of Willowbrook. People passing by stopped to listen. They stood on the sidewalk and on the steps of nearby buildings, drawn by the beautiful music coming from the piano teacher's studio. They did not know that this was goodbye. They did not know that Sophie was playing for someone who could no longer hear. But somehow, somewhere, Margaret was listening. Sophie was sure of it. The music had found her, wherever she was. The connection between teacher and student had not been broken by death. It would never be broken. When Sophie finally stopped playing, the sun was setting. Golden light poured through the windows, illuminating the studio in a warm glow. She looked at her hands, the hands that Margaret had trained, the hands that carried Margaret's legacy forward into the future. She whispered a final thank you into the empty room. Then she stood up, closed the piano gently, and walked out into the fading light. Behind her, the Steinway sat in silence, waiting. It would not have to wait long. Tomorrow, a new teacher would come. New students would arrive. New hands would touch those keys, Dot, and Margaret's music would live on forever.